So as we continue discussing our sort of big overview of what biology is, one of the things that we need to talk about is, once I've defined that something is in fact a living thing, it's an organism, it fits all of those characteristics of what a living organism is, then we tend to move into actually classifying that. And classification schemes are really a nice way for people to be able to have a common language when we're discussing organisms. So really it begins with, what type of cell am I dealing with? If I'm looking either at a single-celled or multicellular organism, we talk about the cells that make up organisms based into either one of two categories. Either it's a prokaryotic cell, in which case it doesn't have a lot of internal structure. In fact, it's got no true nucleus, so there's no nucleus housing their DNA. It's sort of just kind of floating around in the center of their cell. They don't have any membrane-bound organelles, so there's no mitochondria, there's no chloroplasts, there's no Golgi or anything like that. Pro means early, so these are cells that evolved really early on in Earth history. Eventually, over time, and we'll talk about this when we get to evolution, those prokaryotic cells, while they still exist, they're things like bacteria. Eventually, we've kind of leaped forward in terms of internal organization and got to eukaryotic cells. And these are the ones that most kids think about when they look at a model of a cell, because it's got that nucleus, it's got all these internal organelles, internal structure. So we can then classify eukaryotic cells even further into plant versus animal, and the structures that they have that are different there. Plants having things like chloroplast, animal cells not having those sorts of structures because they don't do photosynthesis, which is really what that chloroplast is necessary for. So if I look at the differences, you've got prokaryotes over here, so they've got that, DNA kind of hanging out in the middle, but not really much else is going on. Jump over here and take a look at those eukaryotic cells, and there's so much more internal structure going on. Alright, they've got the nucleus, the Golgi, the endoplasmic reticulum, so on and so forth. So your prokaryotic cells, these are small, primitive cells. They do have genetic information, but it's not enclosed in any sort of membrane, aka they've got no nucleus. Really few, if any, specialized cell parts. There isn't much internal structure, but they may have some additional exterior layers. They may have things like flagella to help them swim, move around in aquatic environments. So things like bacteria are really what we're talking about on a prokaryotic side. Your eukaryotes, on the other hand, much larger, much more advanced because they have that all of that internal structure. They're also going to have evolved in Earth history considerably later. Their DNA now is enclosed in a nucleus, so there is a membrane separating that DNA from the rest of the internal structure of the cell. They've got those specialized organelles, those specialized parts that do certain jobs, as opposed to just having those processes hanging out in the cytoplasm and functioning there. So we've got things like your plant cells, your animal cells, fungi, protists. These are all things that are going to have eukaryotic cells. You have eukaryotic cells. Your DNA is housed in a nucleus. You've got all these internal structures that are specific for the job that cell is supposed to provide for you. So once we determine what kind of cell we're talking about, then we can move forward in our classification. So when we look at modern classification schemes, the domain is sort of the biggest grouping, or the most inclusive, the largest group that we classify. And this is really where you talk about those cell types. So it includes both your archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Those are the three big domains for classification. And archaea and bacteria are both your prokaryotic domains, and then eukarya aka eukaryotic cells, that's where all of those guys that do have a nucleus end up. So archaea and bacteria, they're prokaryotic, no nucleus, and pretty much universally they're going to be unicellular or single-celled organisms that fall into those categories. Your eukarya, on the other hand, eukaryotic, so they've got a nucleus, but there are certain organisms that are unicellular, something like a protist or an amoeba, for an example, is a eukaryotic cell, but it's a single-celled organism. Or they can be multicellular, like us, or plants, or your dog at home. Okay. We then further divide that eukaryotic domain into kingdoms, and this is probably what you've learned in the past. So plant kingdom, animal kingdom, fungus, protists, those are all different kingdoms that are found within then that eukarya domain, and we can divide them even further than that, all the way down to the most specific levels of classification, which includes an organism's scientific name. So it's genus, which is slightly less specific, all the way down to a species, which is its most specific classification. So if I take a look at, once again, a similar idea to what we did with the levels of organization, bottom of the pyramid being the most inclusive, or the least specific, working our way all the way up to the most specific, or least inclusive to the top of the pyramid, this is what you're looking at, right? So if I give you the example of our cute little puppy dog there, puppy is made of eukaryotic cells, so it fits into the domain eukarya. Kingdom, it's an animal, so Animalia. Phylum then is a little more specific, so they are chordates, aka they've got backbone, so Chordata is its phylum. It's a mammal, so class Mammalia, order carnivore, family Candina, Canis being its genus, and then Canis familiaris is specifically the scientific name for a domesticated dog. Okay, so let's say that you are not necessarily in the process or in the need of classifying an organism, but you want to know what an organism is actually called, right? And you're out somewhere and you're looking at some unknown species to you, but you assume it probably already has been classified by scientists. Dichotomous key is one way in which to do that. And these dichotomous keys, di meaning two, is that we look at, alright, I know I'm in a particular place. In this case, we're in Utah. I know I'm looking at evergreen trees, but I want to know specifically the tree that's in front of me. What kind of evergreen am I dealing with? So these keys are set up in pairs of statements, right? And you start at number 1, you work your way down. So starting at number 1, I'm looking at this tree and I'm looking, does it have scaly cones? They're small, they're blue, berry-like. Or are their leaves more needle-like and they've got these big, brown, large cones? So these are my two options. By looking at that tree in this particular location, I need to pick one of those two statements that best describes the organism that I'm seeing in front of me. So let's just assume that the one I'm particularly looking at is this needle-like, and it's got large brown cones. Then it's going to tell me where to go next. So now I'm going to jump down to statement 3, and I've got another pair of statements, right? And let's just say that this particular one, my needles aren't in bundles, they're single, the cones are scaly, scales are paper-like. Okay, so now it tells me to go to another statement. Jump down to number 5. Now I know my needles are square, they're stiff and sharp, and now I've finally come to the conclusion that the particular species of evergreen tree that I'm looking at happens to be a blue spruce. So that's really how these work. And they're a nice way to identify organisms when you don't necessarily know what they are, but your job isn't really out there to be creating some brand new classification scheme for some unknown organism, somebody's already done that. You just don't know what it is and you're trying to identify that.